Hello, friends. Welcome back. Another episode coming your way of the new Evangelicals podcast. All right. On this episode, I have Dr. Yancey, Dr. George Yancey, technically, who wrote the book with Ashley Quizik, One Faith No Longer, The Transformation of Christianity in Red and Blue America. I got a copy of the book. I read the whole thing. It's very fascinating. Their position in the book is that essentially progressive Christianity and conservative Christianity are so far apart, they should be categorized as different religions. And they also talk about how, according to their research, conservative Christianity is more centered around having, quote unquote, the right theology, and progressive Christianity is more centered around having the right, maybe social justice views or more political views. Don't think political in the way of like, I voted for Biden, but more of things that would benefit society. So I brought him on to talk about it because I'll be honest, when I first heard about this book, I read about it in a Gospel Coalition article, and they pretty much used this book to say, look, progressives are more political than conservatives, which is not the case in a lot of ways. And Dr. Yancey and I go over that. Anyway, I really enjoyed this interview. It's very informative. I enjoyed what he had to say. So I hope that you enjoyed the podcast. That being said, as always, thank you everyone for sharing the podcast. If you could continue to do that, sharing the podcast, giving us a rating, it really helps us get into the ears of people who might be looking for a podcast like this, of people who are committed to Jesus, but trying to find new and fresh ways forward. Of course, if you want to support the show, you can do that by clicking on the link in our show notes. All the money goes right back into New Evangelicals. It helps us with our production costs of the podcast, helps cover my time, helps cover other things for the community. Your donations go directly to helping out other people, in need, so to speak. And they are grateful for it, and so are we. We do nothing behind a paywall, friends. Nothing. We don't have extra podcasts behind a Patreon account. We don't have extra access to help behind a paywall. We give everything away for free as resources to people who are hurting and who are in need, as they go through some form of maybe deconstruction or are just kind of fed up with the Evangelical Church and want better ways forward. So thank you to everyone who donates. It really helps us. All right, friends, without further ado, here's my episode. Well, Dr. Yancey, thanks so much for joining us on the New Evangelicals podcast. I'm sure you're very busy, and I appreciate you making time. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You wrote a book called One Faith No Longer. It's written by George Yancey, that's you, and Ashley Quizik, and it's the transformation of Christianity in Red and Blue America. And I think it's safe to say that you argue that based on some of your findings and research, that really progressive Christianity and conservative Christianity really should be categorized as like different religions. Is that fair to say?
I think that's the core of what we're arguing.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to be very transparent with you. All right. Here's how I found you in the book. So someone sent this to me via a Gospel Coalition article, and they really kind of took some of this stuff and made it in the way that they painted the picture was, see, progressives are more politicized than conservatives. And I'm like, I'm not a fan of this. I'm going to look into this book and I'm going to, pick it up, whatever it is. And I read it and I'm like, upon reading the book and thinking about it, I think you make a lot of valid points that I never really considered before. And I think that your research shows that, et cetera. Well, let me ask you this before we get rolling. What was the catalyst for you and for Ashley to actually write a book like this?
Well, I can only speak for myself. Ashley had done her own work separate, and then we sort of pulled it together. So I can only speak for myself.
Gotcha.
It's based on another article that I'd worked on. And I was looking at how academics perceive conservative Protestants. And this gives a surprise to me and I think when things come as a surprise to me, I kind of like it better because then my presuppositions is not influencing it.
Right.
When I looked at that data, which is only academics, I looked at mainline Protestants and conservative Protestants. And what I found was that mainline Protestants actually ranked conservative Protestants below atheists and Muslims and non-Christian groups. Whereas the reverse is true for conservative Protestants. They rank mainline Protestants above those groups, and just not quite as high as conservative Protestants. And that surprised me because up until that point, I had the mindset that I think a lot of people had. Mindset is that, okay, if you're a Christian, you may disagree with other Christians, but at least they're Christians and they're part of your group. But that showed me that that was not the case for mainline Protestants. And so this got the question in my mind as to what was happening here and why this was occurring in this way. I think the political finding, which I know is getting a lot of play on more conservative websites. And that's one of the findings that I'm not going to walk away from that. Now I'll be happy to discuss that and defend that if necessary. But to me, that's not the core of what I want the book to say. It helps fit into what I'm trying to do. But the core of what I think, what I saw that day, beginning to see that day, was that there is this sort of split that's there that's much more deeper than people give it credit for. To the point to where I really come to the conclusion that that what we call progressive Christians, the way that I've operationalized it, and conservative Christians really are becoming two different distinct religions.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. Quick side note: is that microphone supposed to be on and working?
Yes. Is it not coming through?
I think you're still on your computer mic.
Okay.
If you want to check the settings. Yeah. If not, it's okay. Your audio is okay. We can fix it in post if we need to.
Okay. Let me see if I can.
Usually it's under that little mute up arrow. You can change your select microphone.
I don't know if this does anything. Is that better?
It's the same, but it's totally okay. I just want to make sure you're okay with it.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Don't worry about it. It's no worries.
I probably need a better speaker.
I trust me, I get it. I interview a lot of people. I see all different kinds of setups, and you do what you got to do, you know?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. So I'll edit that part out. Don't worry about that. So why don't we start here? First off, why don't you kind of give us your background for the audience? You know, what is your background? What got you into the field that you study, etc.?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I'm a sociologist. I actually spent the first 15, maybe 20 years as an academic. I look younger than I am, studying racial issues and focusing mostly on racial issues. Probably about 10 years ago, I went away from that because I really got curious about issues surrounding religion a lot more. I am a Christian. By my definition that I use, I would consider myself a conservative Christian, but politically, I'm more in the middle. So, you know, so that got me wanting to study some of these issues. I've written books on atheism. I've written books on cultural progressives, and so looking at this sort of divide between progressive Christians and conservative Christians kind of erupted from that. I've studied anti-Christian bias in society. And so it sort of was a natural pathway to then looking at this issue, which is the divide within Christianity.
That's helpful. And who is this book really aimed towards? Like who did you have in mind when you were writing it?
Well, it's an academic book, so hopefully it gets adopted in certain academic courses and that sort of thing. But honestly, I think I was trying to, and I don't know if I was successful or not, I was trying to say something to both conservative Christians and progressive Christians. It is an academic book, and I'm not trying to be preaching on this book.
Right.
But I do think that the data says something to both groups that they both could benefit from.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to write a book that both progressive Christians and conservative Christians will appreciate, I think is a nice task.
Well, I can't say I speak for every single person reading the book, but even though I came into it with maybe a more pessimistic perspective, I did enjoy reading it. I found it very helpful. I found some of the findings provocative, and I was like, okay, and again, I'm also trying to be better at challenging my own biases, right? And just letting the data that we're finding speak for itself. So but let's start here, and then we'll kind of dive into some of the questions I have. How do you define in the book conservative Christians and especially progressives? Because you even make the point in the book that it's really hard to pin down what is a progressive Christian. Where did you end up landing for the sake of the book?
Yes, and so what do we mean by progressive Christian? Do you mean that a person's a Christian who votes for Democrats, or do you mean something theologically? And that's
right.
And so there's different ways. So I'm not saying that this is the only way it can be operationalized.
Yeah.
But the way we decided to operationalize it was by theology.
Okay.
And so we use two questions. I've heard people say, well, you can look at this and that and what have you. Fair points. But what the research shows is that these two perspectives are highly correlated with a lot of other theological differences. Now, those two theological differences that I looked at was, do you see the Bible as the Word of God, or do you see the Bible as a holy book, a good book, but not necessarily the inerrant Word of God? That was one division. The other division was whether or not a person sees Jesus Christ as the only way to salvation. Or do other religions or other beliefs provide ways to salvation? And so we use that as the criteria for separating the groups into either conservative Christians or progressive Christians. Because my thinking is that if you just start at the theological level and then look at larger differences, then you have an argument that these theological differences matter in other ways of thinking. And that's kind of what we found.
Yeah, that is helpful to have those kind of two criteria. And I appreciate, like you said, this is not the only way to categorize progressives. And to be fair, it is hard because I've been told, on my account, oh, you're really progressive. I'm like, I still from a risen Jesus, which a lot of my progressive friends don't, right? Yeah. So there's that way of looking at things. And I would say that while I would say that, yes, the Bible is divine and is infallible, I would not use the term inerrant only because of the fundamentalist baggage that's picked up in my context growing up that, inerrant means a literal 6-day creation, right? So I feel like a lot of people are kind of in the middle, but I think it's definitely a good way of looking at it. So, okay, let's get to some of my questions because I appreciate, again, that you're very fair in the book. Now, the research you pull from is from the 2012 election cycle. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then you also pull from some blog posts of all different, progressives and conservatives. And again, really, really great points. I think one of my first questions is kind of get one of the big ones from me out of the way. Do you think that due to the 2016 and 2020 elections, some of this stuff is even murkier than maybe even we thought based on 2012? Meaning, what I'm seeing is this, or I'll give you a great example. Kenneth Copeland and James White. All right. James White is he represents everything that is super fundamentalist, conservative, Doug Wilson type. Kenneth Copeland's the opposite of that. They theologically disagree on almost everything, but I see them pushing the same anti-vax rhetoric, the same political rhetoric, etc. So when I started reading the book and saw the Gospel Coalition article that I first found, I thought, well, this isn't fitting into my categories of seeing also now more conservatives starting to align more over political issues than theological issues.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. And since I didn't use the 2016 data or the 2020 data that they've come out with, I have to be careful on how I say this. My suspicion is that the divide has worsened 2016, and my suspicion is because of Donald Trump. Yeah, the divide has worsened. Yeah, and so what we see here, and once again, this is not something I've studied, so as I talk about it, I have to be a little bit ginger. I think we've seen a spat of, for lack of a better term, deconstructionist books come out lately. Yeah, by people who are either former conservative Christians or conservative Christians who are deconstructing their faith. Yeah. Or speaking for those who are, if they're not doing it themselves. Right. And and I can give you some examples if you want. But I think that is somewhat of a reflection of the trauma that happened in 2016. And some of the schisms that happened. And so my suspicion is that these divisions are worse than they have been. Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. And again, I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm really looking just for your wisdom as a sociologist, because you study this way more than me. And you see trends earlier than most of us do due to your line of work. And I would just want to say, I tend to agree with your suspicion on that. Obviously, I'm not asking for verifiable data, but I am one of those people who in 2016, right, saw the push for Trump, saw what was happening, saw the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, saw the murder of George Floyd, and said, oh my gosh, something is wrong with my movement when I'm seeing pastors who I know retweeting Candace Owens' talking points about George Floyd. I'm like, okay, my head is spinning now, right? And I think that is one of the reasons, and maybe one out of several, but I think in my view, one of the suspicions I have of why maybe progressives view conservative Christians with more disdain than the other way around is because a lot of, not everyone, but a lot of those people have walked out of evangelical conservative circles and are very frustrated with the amount of harm that in their perspective, those circles are doing, Sure. Yeah. I mean, we didn't measure, and I couldn't with the data set that I had measure whether or not a person had been an evangelical Christian in terms of progressive Christian or not. Yeah. And I think that there are some of that. And, some of the qualitative data suggests, well, it's kind of like, I mean, there's the old saying, the person who hates smoking the worst is the ex-smoker, and this is a little aside, but
Sure.
The people who hate Catholics the most are ex-Catholics. So
Yes.
my Hispanic friends
Mm.
who used to be Catholic or not Catholic are the hardest on Catholics. So
Mm.
I do think there is something to that. In other words, I think there's something that perhaps some of the strongest animosity, it well may be that even though progressive Christians on average hold conservative Christians more disdain than vice versa, that within that group, and I suspect this is true to some degree,
Yeah.
there's individuals who are especially disdainful, and they probably are more likely to come from people who speak conservative Christians.
Yeah.
And that would not surprise me at all.
Well, that makes sense too, because in the book you do a lot of study with how both camps view Muslims, the Muslim community, right? And you make the point that there are several people in the more conservative, camp of Christianity now who are maybe ex-Muslims who are very harsh, right, on the Muslim community, right? And so I think that really rings true, honestly.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. I mean, you're right. Now I remember that. Yeah, that there's another example of that. And so that I think that is probably the case. The thing when we leave something, and I think there's some certain, if I remember correctly, there's certain social psychological elements of that. Like you have to justify leaving something, and so your memory of it's going to make it probably worse than it really was. I mean, I'm not trying to, I don't want to like discount the pain a person felt or anything like that.
Sure.
But chances are, just from social psychological, that you probably are building up worse than it actually was, and downgrade the good things that were there and upgrade the bad things because it helps to justify that. And we're all susceptible to that. I mean, there's definitely that's I think we're all susceptible to that.
Well, I think that is a fair point to a degree. The people I deal with, okay, our social media account, our channels, we've gotten over 10,000 DMs this past year alone on Instagram from people who are really who have experienced major harm and trauma from evangelical conservative spaces. And so we hold space for that. And we are here to be a healing place as much as we can, to help people walk through that, because it's very traumatic, especially when you lose communities, recently. However, sometimes what we'll do is like for a question and response in our stories on Instagram, I'll say, hey, yes, we know, and I'm also unfortunate right now, a casualty of this as well. We know that we've been hurt by these spaces, and we're no longer a part of them. But what was some good? Give me a few good memories. And all of a sudden we get all these DMs. Actually, I missed this. I missed that. So I do think you're right, where it's like, yes, when trauma happens, you have to protect yourself. I get that. But I think that if we do some deep dives, we can all look back on some memories that were fond, right? So I think it's a very fair point. Okay, I have a few more questions, and I want to preface, these are not, my questions are simply to have you explain a little bit more about some of the comments in the book. They're not gotcha questions. I like good faith dialogue. So don't take these any kind of way. That's not the point, because I really enjoyed the book. So it says, okay, on page 205, you made the point that progressives value modernist values and conservatives do not. Now, in my experience, what I wrote down was modernism teaches that we can know absolute truth, which seems to be more of a conservative value, not a progressive one. Was I misreading that, or can you unpack that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, I don't think we meant modernists in the philosophical sense, and maybe the way that we wrote it came across that way. Then that's on us. So I don't think we made it that way. What we're looking at is more we're talking about modernists. We're talking about, well, actually, I know where that comes from. As you well know, that there was the modernist versus fundamentalist conflict in the early part. And so when we're talking about modernist values, we're really looking at that, which is really more grounded in the notion of the social gospel and reform and those sort of elements.
Yeah, take it.
So I can see where you could then take the modernist philosophical approach and say, is that where we're at? No, that's not where we're at. And that's fair.
Okay, fair enough. I kind of hinted on this earlier. You said that conservatives are not as politically centered as progressives. And then one of my points was, yet the moral majority exists, and the conservative evangelical vote is one of the largest voting blocks in America, right? So can you maybe unpack that a little bit for us as well?
Yeah. Okay, so here's the example I give in class.
Perfect.
All right, men are taller than women, but most men are not as tall as Brittany Griner. You know who she is. She's the basketball player, 6'8". So even if we're correct, I think we're correct, is that progressives are more politically charged than conservatives, it does not mean that there's not conservatives are politically charged. Now, my suspicion is that conservatives became more politically charged in 2016 due to Trumpism. However you want to describe that. But that's my suspicion. I don't have any evidence to show that that's the case, but that's my suspicion. And so we're seeing even more. And the moral majority has been on this for a while. But you also have to remember the moral majority came out of a Christian sort of atmosphere that was pretty apolitical. That was more otherworldly. You know, we're not gonna get our hands dirty with this politics stuff.
Yes.
And when you can contrast that atmosphere to what the moral majority is, then all of a sudden it looks like the moral majority is this huge monster.
Right.
It's like if you go from 20 to 50, that's a huge jump. But you're still at 50, you're not at 100. And so that's a way to look at it. Whereas the more modernists were already in this, you know, just using these numbers in the 60s or 70s as far as their political activism.
Right.
So yes, there's definitely a political engine among sort of Christians. And I think the loudest voices get the play a lot more. And so, and they have large numbers, and they vote very highly towards one political party. So all those things factor in. So that's not to say that we can't ignore them as a political force. Obviously, we can't. But just per capita, they're not as politically engaged as progressive Christians.
That's data that I have to still process, you know, because my experience is so different than that data that you discovered in your research. And I grew up in the machine, you know, kind of was always taught like we always vote Republican, we always vote, etc. And even in some of my, and I want to preface, I am not a scholar, I am not an academic. So some of my amateur studies, right, some of my reading of the moral majority and stuff, it just seems like to me that, and again, maybe because I grew up in these circles, I know them better than more mainline Protestants, where I'm sure people have had the same experience on the other end. But it just seems like for me, a lot of what I was centered around was definitely theology. And then like the fruit of that was, here's how we vote politically, which I think actually you make the point of that in your book, where conservative Christians are really centered around specific theological claims, while progressives are more flexible with who's in and who's out theologically, but are more centered around maybe more social values. Is that a fair way of saying it?
I think it's very fair. Let me just say as a data point to give you and your readers as to sort of think about this. Yeah. It's absolutely true that there are some conservative Christians that their religion and their politics were one and the same. You know, that's absolutely the case, that there are some of there. Now the question is, how many and what percentage and all that sort of stuff. The chapter on the blogs, I think, is quite telling, because it really shows the schism among conservative Christians with the Republican Party. And even if you don't read the chapter of blogs, you just think about people like David French, you know, Nat Nazareth, you know, other conservative Christians who are conservative Christians, and yet they're at schism with the Republican Party. It's hard for me to think of a progressive Christian who's at a schism with the Democrat Party. Now, I'm sure there are people out there who, for example, we looked at pro-life progressive Christians. Right. And even though they disagree with the Democratic Party, they really don't challenge them in the same way, say, David French does with the Republican Party. And so I think you can see this more political diversity among conservative Christians if you don't just look at the ones who are, for lack of a better term, in the tank. They're there, but you don't see the same sort of critiquing of the Democratic Party by progressive Christians as you do with conservative Christians.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about that when I was reading it. You always try and match what you're reading to some experience in your life, and I think I actually found one that kind of made me go, okay, I can see this now. So my own previous church, you know, everything was fine with my political views until I started being outspoken about some theological views on new evangelicals. Then there was a problem. When I started pushing up against queer inclusion biblically, or how we view certain other issues, that's when it was a problem. Now, in that church, people who were, you know, Trump supporters, QAnon supporters, Black Lives Matter supporters, all lived fine. But when I started talking about theological issues, then people started to get concerned about my faith, so to speak. So I think that was maybe a moment where I thought, you know what? On second thought, at first I thought it might have been political, but it really wasn't. The foundation of what I was pushing up against was more theological for them. And because they have very specific boundaries drawn around those theologies, and I hit that wall, I was no longer welcome to be part of that group. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yes.
It kind of backs up one of your statements,
Yeah.
or one of the main points of the book. Okay, let's see what else I have here. Yeah, these
Oh,
are
by
all
the
really...
way, I've also done some research on a different book where I looked at Christian colleges,
Oh.
and what I find is that Protestant colleges. What I find is that conservative Protestant colleges are more flexible politically than your average college. That they're more welcoming of different political perspectives. I mean, people think of, and there are some examples of this being the case, but your typical Protestant school welcomes conservatives and progressives, whereas, to be honest, conservatives are not welcome at a state school. If we're really being very honest about that. What they don't welcome is theological diversity. And so, it's a different research, but it sort of reinforces my claim that for conservative Christians, it's about the theology, and they can tolerate political diversity, but they can't tolerate theological diversity.
That actually does make a lot of sense, because I'm even thinking about some of the more recent like Twitter things happening with different people, and it seems like a lot of, I call them Theo bros. That's my name for them. I find that a lot of those guys will critique people on theological grounds, even if the book they're critiquing isn't claiming to be a theological book. A great example of this is the book that Kristen Dumais recently wrote, Jesus and John Wayne, which is really a historical look at how we got a lot of what we're standing on now with masculinity and patriarchy, etc. And a couple of people have critiqued the book as not being like foundationally biblical enough, quote unquote. And she's like, well, it's a historical book. It's not a theological book, right? So it does seem like these circles are always trying to shoehorn, no matter what it is, something into the theological world. Even more recently with like critical race theory, right? We have people in these worlds who are writing books, like I have Vadi Bakkum's book, Fault Lines, where he's really trying to change the discussion from a legal theory to a theological worldview. And people are like, well, it's not claiming to be that, but maybe that's why they're so adamant about doing that, because they have, because theology is so central to what they believe. I'm just spitballing at this point here. That's why they feel the need to take everything through the lens of, okay, theologically, how does this fit into a theological framework, even if what they're critiquing isn't theological in nature?
Yeah, and if you think about this stuff, this is also an opportunity, because I have a friend who teaches sociology at a conservative Christian campus, and he said, once I convince my students theologically that racism was something we tackled and institutional racism was a problem, and it was important, then I had them. If I didn't convince them of that, then they will just learn and parrot and then move on. And so once you understand this, you can actually reach people, because that that's what's important to them. It's the mind of the listener. And so that's kind of a way of looking at this, is not just, okay, this is what they are, but if we want to convince them about something, here's the pathway in order to do that.
That is helpful. And it's tough for me, because I've really walked out of that world, and I don't want to really go back into having to prove everything biblically, because sometimes the Bible just doesn't have answers to certain categories that we're dealing with. But I think you make a very astute point, where now that we know this, we can get through to people really in their own language, right? Everyone has that, which is helpful to know. So in your view, in your opinion, based on your studies, do you see, you kind of mentioned that in your view, even though you haven't studied this at length yet, the divide has probably gotten worse. Do you see it continuing just to get worse and worse over time, with the way, Christian nationalism, stuff like that's really rising now? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really don't see a coming back together of progressive conservative Christians. Of course, I'm not God, and things can happen. And,
of course,
obviously, I'm speaking as a human social scientist looking at this.
Sure.
But it's sort of like, it's like this way. Have you been in a relationship and you reach the point where you said to yourself, and the relationship went bad, reached the point and said, I can't see a path back to her. I think that's what it is. I think those, people who've been in relationships gone bad, there comes a point of no return. You say, whether it's my fault, her fault, whatever, things have happened that I can't see a path back to her.
Yeah.
I think that's what's happened. I don't see that path, because I think that the way they construct meaning is so different, that that I don't see how the groups find some sort of way of reuniting. And in fact, in denominations today, we're seeing a split happening. So yeah, I'm pessimistic about that.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I don't know how to get back and how to build bridges. And it's not about making enemies for us. We're really big on not dehumanizing, these people, everyone's made in the image of God, etc. But it just seems like our views of both theology and social issues are just so vastly different and only growing further and further apart.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I think one example of this for me that was a moment of like, how can I go back to this, was a couple months ago, a church in California, I say this example a lot, had George Flynn, or General Flynn, who's a disgraced general. He was one of Trump's guys, convicted of crimes, and Trump pardoned him. And now he's speaking at churches, and he was there at church talking about how we need, America to come back to God, et cetera. The election was stolen. And the pastors of the church came out on the stage with him and gifted him an AR-15 to a round of applause.
I heard that one.
And he took it and on the church platform says, and I have video of this, man, maybe I should go down to DC with this, 2 more rounds of applause, right? And so people like me see that in these evangelical spaces, and we go, I could never be a part of something like this that might see that and then says nothing. I mean, no one talked about it. I had to dig up and find it. And I think those are examples like that time and time again, on top of the really conservative media really taking over Christian language and kind of grabbing that group, the talk radio hosts of the world. We look at that and I go, I don't know what I want yet. I just know it's not that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So I think I might agree with you on that.
Yeah. I think for me, I say this as a Christian, as a scholar, as a citizen of this country.
Yeah.
But I think what I hope for, since I don't, unless God decides to do something, I don't hold out hope that's going to be, I hope that we can learn how to live with each other.
Yeah.
And I think, to accept that, this group exists, that group exists. We disagree, but we can live with each other and that sort of thing. I think that honestly is the goal we should think about.
Yeah.
Because, the schisms are too great at this point.
As a sociologist, what have you found? Like what are some of the breaking points that happen with groups of people before things get violent? And I don't want violence ever. That's not a thing that any of us want. But we saw the insurrection. We see what's happening. For you as a sociologist, what lens do you see that kind of stuff through?
Yeah, I've never really not studied social movements and social change to know all the markers of that. I mean,
sure.
I see enough that I'm concerned, and to be honest, I'm concerned with both violence on both sides. I think it's a mistake just to focus in on January 6th and forget about violence that happened last summer, because it's not good whether it's done either way.
Okay.
And I'm concerned about violence. I am concerned about violence. No matter I just came to the conclusion a couple of weeks ago. 2024.
Yeah.
No matter who wins, if a Republican wins, we're going to hear calls of voter suppression. Democrat wins, we're going to hear calls of voter fraud. In other words, no matter who wins, we already have in place justifications for nullifying the election and going our own way. That bothers me. That disturbs me. I'm raising 3 young boys. Yeah. I don't want to raise them in a country where people are tearing at each other.
Yeah. I
wish I had the answer to that.
Yeah.
I don't think there is an easy answer to that.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it's a good question.
We have an 18-month-old and I feel the same way. And we went on the way and I'm like, what kind of society are we going to have in 10 years from now?
Yeah.
And I do want to be fair. So I want to give you time to respond and give me your thoughts on the problems that you see in progressive Christianity as well. So we're going to get there. So hang on to that thought for a minute. Because it's important for me to be able to hear that stuff as well.
Sure.
We say often in our side, I don't want to become a fundamentalist all over again, right? And that's really easy to do. It's easy to leave one fundamentalism to go to a different kind of fundamentalism. And again, maybe this isn't like your main focus, and you don't have to answer the question if you don't want to. Do you think though that, again, I'm not a historian, I'm not a sociologist. It just seems like forget who Trump was supported by. Forget that for a second. Just the person of Trump seemed to really push things to maybe a new level that I haven't experienced before. And the election fraud thing was one that I voted several times. I'm 33. I've been around a little bit. I can't think of any time in history where it was that intense and that supported by so many people to the point where something like what we saw on January 6th happened. Any thoughts on that? And again, you don't have to answer. I was just kind of curious to pick your brain.
Yeah, you know, I think Trump is a very unique politician, if you will. You know, I had friends, still my friends, who are Christians and Democrats, and they vote for Democrats, but they understood why Christians vote for Republicans. You know, there's like, well, I disagree, but I understand. They could not understand Christians voting for Trump. There was no facade that, there wasn't at least a facade that this is a good Christian man, you know, who I disagree with. And, you know, as a Christian, I struggle sometimes with why my friends voted for Trump, you know, and that sort of thing. Yeah. And so I think that he is and obviously the situation division that happened is not totally his fault. I mean, that existed pre-Trump. And anyone thinks, well, Trump brought all of this here, it's just for themselves.
Right.
They're exaggerating. But he has clearly made it worse. I had some hope that maybe when he was no longer president, that things might calm down. And there's still a chance that may happen. There's still a chance that some people may wake up and say, look, he is so bad that even though there's something about him I like, I'm just going to jettison him out of the party. But to this day, to this point, that's not happening. He's just made things worse. And so he is a uniquely polarizing politician. And I don't know, you know, I don't know how do you deal with that unless somehow he is taken off the stage. You know, and I don't know how. I can see how that could happen. I just haven't seen it happen yet. I was hoping maybe with what happened in Georgia that some Republicans would say, okay, we just got to get this guy, get rid of this guy. That's not completely happened yet. Maybe 2022 won't be as good as they hopefully Republicans will go, okay, we got to get rid of this guy. He's really poison to us. I think that's what it's going to take. And it's going to get him on the stage, and then we'll have our normal level of polarization and dehumanization. This extraordinary level of
get back down to normal of we're just dehumanizing people
normal dehumanization.
Gently. Well, I think that it really is a great point, and it's something I wrestle with. You know, I really wrestle with that. I wrestled a lot, like I said earlier, with people who I knew, pastors who were supporting someone who, even on a sexual purity level, just missed all the marks. And I grew up in a church culture that taught me sexual purity was number one. You know, so
I was taught we couldn't vote for Clinton because he was a moral person. And you know what? I actually believed at the time. And I still kind of believe that. I mean, I'm not someone perfect, but someone who cheats on their wives repeatedly, consistently. I actually take that person out of my consideration. I don't care what their politics. I take them out of my consideration because then I can't trust you.
Right.
So I was taught that with Clinton. And then when Trump comes along, everyone goes, no, never mind. Yeah, I'm like, what's up with that?
Right. And I really think that is in what we hear, that is one of the main ingredients into the cake of modern deconstruction. You know, that is one of the people woke up and said, whoa, what has happened to my faith tradition? And I think that, again, it all comes back down to even what you say in your book, where I think that is one of the reasons why progressives, quote unquote, do see conservatives with more disdain, because we just can't, I can't find the logic. I can't find the biblical theology for it. Right. So it's one of those moments where I'm like, okay, pastor, help me see the biblical support for Trump. And they're like, well, Cyrus. I'm like, Cyrus, what are you talking about? You know, they're just pulling random things. I think that is maybe why I can't solve this Rubik's Cube, right? It's not like I can say, well, biblically, I can see how you can interpret those verses this way to make your case. Instead, it's like, I don't see any foundation besides the foundation of power. But again, I know that I'm not here to have you beat those guys up. You know?
I think all that critique is fair, and I've offered my own critiques. You know, even though I still consider myself a conservative Christian,
right?
I've offered my own critiques to my fellow conservative Christians about why Trump support is not very
Fair enough. So
Yeah.
what are some of your critiques you think for progressive Christians? Like in your study, in your research, what are some blind spots that you're thinking, hey, they should be on the lookout for this? Like you guys should be aware of this happening.
Yeah. I think my critique for progressive Christians would be to truly live out the values that they said they want to live. Here's what I mean by this.
Yeah.
You know, progressive Christians talk about inclusiveness and love and tolerance. And I'm sure they've given a lot of sermons on hate. Have they given a sermon on hate where the target was someone who was a MAGA supporter? Because if you're talking about hate and you're only including sexual minorities and people of color, well, that's probably not a big problem for most of the people in the congregation. And I just keep being reminded of the Samaritans and the story of the Good Samaritan and the woman at the well. And as a Christian, you know, if you know anything about the Samaritans were a half-breed, according to the Jews, group who were intruded on them. There was a group that they really hated. And so how are we supposed to treat the people that we don't like is how the Samaritans are treated in the New Testament.
Yeah.
I have to be honest, I don't see a lot of that with the progressive Christians. I don't, you know, I see and maybe, you know, maybe part is they feel the need to express what they've gone through, and I understand that to a degree. But I think as Christians, that we're supposed to be trying to do better, then we have to question that. And so that would be my critique of progressive Christians. I joined a couple of progressive Christian Facebook discussion groups and just laid back and just listened to them and honestly, some of the dehumanizing I saw there was honestly, I have to be very honest.
Yeah.
Most part of some of the conservative Christian groups. Progressive Christians dehumanize conservative Christians much more than vice versa. Conservative Christians critique progressive Christians and say they're wrong. Progressive Christians say progressive Christians are evil. I think there's a very big difference in there. And if what I want is two groups that would have to get along with each other, to me that has to be dealt with, or else it just won't happen. So that would be my major critique for progressive Christians. Yes.
I think that's a really fair point. I think it is easy to dehumanize the other. I think even theologically, like, you know, we're trying to be a part of stopping the cycle of chaos on the world, not repeating the cycle of chaos, right?
Yeah.
And I think once we dehumanize the other, it's problematic. In fact, I just responded to a TikTok video because I have to be cool and hip in order to stay relevant these days. And there was a video, and I'll tell you what it was. It was this guy who I guess was waiting in line to talk to Joel Osteen. All right. Now I'm not a big Joel Osteen fan at all. And he grabs him and he goes, "Hey, Joel," it's on camera. And he goes, "Do you know that you're a piece of shit?" Right to Joel Osteen. And Joel like laughs and walks away. And the clip goes viral. And people are like, "Yeah, he's a piece of shit." And I'm like, I responded and said, okay, I'm not a Joel Osteen fan at all. His theology is problematic. They just found bags of money in the walls. Like, he has major issues. But once we start dehumanizing and calling people less than the Imago Dei, we're now repeating the exact cycle that we're trying to stop. And I'm not saying it's easy. And as a white privileged man, I can't say I've ever had someone oppressing me in certain ways, right? So I get that. But we have to start somewhere, and clips like that I see, I'm like, you're not helping the conversation. Like, that isn't doing us any good. And I agree with you. We have to stop the dehumanization, even when it's really difficult. And frankly, for me, being honest with you, George, it is really hard when I see Trump and I see Lauren Boebert out there. You know, it's just like, what is happening? But it is the call of Christ, in my view. It is the call of the Christ, the Messiah, of a new way of being human that is not about devaluing humanity made in the image of God.
You know, one way to think about it is this. You know, if we're Christians, we're supposed to be something that is beyond what our culture can give us. We're supposed to find strength beyond our culture can give us. And so regardless of if we have political differences or something like that, there should be something different from us. And so if there's nothing different from us than this other group out there, then what good is it? If progressive Christians sound just like political progressives in the way they dehumanize other individuals, well, why does it matter to be a progressive Christian? Why just say I'm a progressive and my Christianity is just something? Now, I'm not saying that that's what progressives and Christians are doing. I'm just saying that whenever they dehumanize others, that's what I tend to think. I didn't think, okay, they're just progressives. I mean, their Christianity really doesn't matter that much. And they're just progressives, and these are their enemies, and they're going to put them down like dogs. And so that's, as someone who is, I would say, kind of in the middle of both. Theologically, I'm sort of Christian. Politically, I probably agree with you more than disagree. I know there's things I do disagree with progressives on, but I probably agree more than disagree.
Yeah.
But in the middle, I this is one of the reasons why I probably don't fit. I don't fit with some of the political agenda I find my conservative friends.
Yeah.
But I also don't fit with some of what I see the progressive Christians. So I just sort of, that's why I'm a sociologist. I just stay in the middle and be the umpire, I guess.
Well, the book really is, honestly, I recommend it for anyone out there listening who just wants a different perspective that might challenge some of their own views. I think it's important to be challenged. And I think that the book is really well written, and it does, I mean, for someone, again, who's not in academic circles, it is very readable. I was able to track with it. I was able to understand it. And that is hard to do, to also be academic and also be, for more like the pop general.
Yeah, we put all the nerd stuff in the appendix. So
yeah. Well, I stopped there. I'm like, appendix. I finished that, So what is next for you, George? Like anything on your radar for like, I want to study this in sociology.
Well, what's interesting, I told you that I stopped really looking at race, about 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, last year, I believe God called me back and looked at racial issues. And part of it was Albury and such. So I have a book coming out by University Press, on what I would argue is a Christian approach to deal with racial issues, but I do pull from a lot of research out there, and I'm doing some of my own research on this because I want to investigate whether or not there's a better approach than what we've done thus far on racial issues than what we've seen. So that's kind of my big push at this point.
I'm excited to read that. I think a lot of us, I'll use myself as an example. I know the audience out there probably feels the same way in a lot of respects. A lot of us have, maybe for the first time, really taken a hard and painful look at the way that America has treated, minority groups, the way that America has treated people like that. And I never really realized it until, I'm shameful to say, until Ahmaud Arbery. That was the moment where I said something, I don't know what it is, but something's wrong. I have to take a better look at this. And that really, led me down the rabbit hole of just, listening to other voices that I never really listened to before, et cetera. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you come out with, because I do feel like it's a conversation that the church in general, like all of them, all the church needs to really start taking more seriously, and start really looking at and having some hard conversations, frankly. So I'm looking forward to reading that when it comes out, because I talked to University Press. They send me some books sometimes, so I'll make sure I request that one.
Okay, sounds great.
And then we'll get you back on the show. Is there anywhere that people can find you? Are you on social media, or is it mainly just through your books?
Yeah, I'm a Facebook, Twitter guy. TikTok, I think I'm just gonna leave with you young folks. I don't think I can go there. Sorry. Yeah, I do have a website. It's georgeyancy.com, but there's a George Yancy who spells his name without an E, Yancy. That's not me. C-E-Y. And we get confused all the time because he also writes on racial issues. Oh. So he's a different person, philosopher. So yeah, so I'm pretty easy to find. I don't have any Secret Service or anything like that.
Great. Well, I'll make sure I put that in the show notes. And again, I appreciate making time for us and for the community. You offer a lot of things for us to think about and chew on. So thank you for that.
Thank you. God bless.
You too.